I think now is a great time for us to discuss AMD's GPU plans for the next 12 to 24 months. Team Red have just announced the RX 5500 series, aka Navi 14, but thanks to numerous leaks we also have a great understanding of what's going on with Navi 12, aka the higher performance tier RDNA based GPUs which are expected to also launch. Now maybe this is just my opinion, but personally I think there was much more excitement for Navi than even the Zen 2 architecture in Ryzen 3000. My thought process here is that while the Turing series of cards from Nvidia was great and all, there was also a lot of frustration from gamers of the price and performance ratio that Nvidia offered in traditional rasterization. So, while AMD was still there to offer products like the RX 580 and other SKUs at the $200 mark, we were lacking a competitor in the higher performance tiers. My name's Paul and I hope you enjoy this RedGamingTech.com video. It's also an article, so if you do prefer the written word, you can find the link, of course, in the description of this very video. The Radeon RX 5700 and RX 5700 XTs launched in July, forcing Nvidia's hand to refresh the GeForce 20 series with Super. These essentially improved the price/performance ratio of Nvidia's GeForce 20 series versus what we saw with the launch products. Back when I first leaked that there'd be a Turing refresh coming, I'd heard that Nvidia was simply planning to crank the clock frequencies of the memory. But in the end, we also saw a higher CUDA core count and GPU clock frequencies too. A potential sign that Nvidia felt that the extra memory bandwidth alone just wouldn't be enough to fend off Navi 10. But let's get back to Navi. With the two highest performing graphics cards currently in the RDNA lineup, the Radeon RX 5700 and RX 5700 XT both use the Navi 10 die. It's a 251mm² chip with 2560 RDNA shaders, equaling 40 compute units, in the fully enabled core found in the XT SKU. And this is sitting on a 256-bit GDDR6 bus with its 8GB of memory clocked up to 14 Gbps, providing a grand total of 448GB per second of bandwidth. Given AMD's decision to not use a chiplet-based approach for its GPUs, at least for now, it made more sense for the company to use a more modestly sized design to start off Navi. And this is something that one of my sources has actually backed up. We'll get more into that in just a moment. Indeed, the company have done the same previously with, say, Polaris. The RX 470 and 480 core measured just 232mm² on the then new 14nm LPP process. That's certainly not a hop, skip and a jump away from the 251mm² chip of Navi 10 found in the RX 5700 series. With Polaris we saw a new node and architecture. This was a change from the 28nm Fiji architecture which was found in the RX 300 series. Now in case of Polaris we didn't end up with a bigger die variant in the shape of the long-rumoured RX 490, despite plenty of evidence that the company were planning to release it. Indeed, several of AMD's partner AIBs actually listed the card. AMD themselves got in on the act and shown the card on their own website's drop-down, and the card also appeared in the Ashes of the Singularity along with other benchmarking databases. We know the silicon existed, but just did not make it into mass production. RX 490 was held back, so that all of AMD's resources and marketing resources could be pushed instead into the then soon to be released RX Vega 56 and Vega 64, at least if you believe the whispers. And AMD's smaller GPU first approach was also backed up by one of my sources. We'll refer to them as Source 1, who told me that the company had a lot of problems during the tape out with Navi, and AMD has decided that because of the complexities of designing a new architecture and shifting to the 7nm process, they needed to start with a more modestly sized chip. Actually, Prior to the launch of Navi earlier this year, another source had told me that Navi had been, quote, a nightmare, end quote. And indeed, I had conversations with Jim over the Door TV, who told me that his sources had said similar to mine. Oh, and while this is getting slightly off topic, it's also worth remembering that the Radeon 7 GPU uses a Vega 20 die that's 331mm squared, far larger than the RX 5700 XT's Navi 10 die, once again 251mm squared. But also remember that the number of compute units in the Radeon 7 was just 60, compared to 64 of the Vega 64. The same number therefore as the Radeon Instinct MI50, albeit with the Radeon 7 featuring a quarter double precision, equaling 3.5 teraflops compared to the MI50's 6.7 teraflops, which was half single precision. AMD's decision to release Radeon 7 with only 60 compute units likely says that the Vega 20 yields at the start weren't the best, and at a guess, the 331mm squared die of the Vega 20/Radeon 7 probably isn't too far off what we'd see for a Navi 12 core, given the obvious bump in shaders. We'll get back to this. What we know about Navi 14 is based upon the driver entries that it appears to be the same architecture as Navi 10, albeit smaller and less powerful. And the information of the specifications of the chip is that it measures 158mm squared, contains 1408 shaders, 22 compute units, and sits on a 128-bit memory bus, with either 4 or 8 GB of memory that's running at 14 Gbps, totaling 224 GB per second of bandwidth. Navi 12, on the other hand, is different to Navi 10's architecture. For one, the driver code that we've seen is actually slightly different from the code we've seen in Navi 10, whereas Navi 12's code is pretty much identical. This indicates that the architecture has gone under some tweaks and tucks. There's also the question therefore what the performance targets of the RX 5800 and 5800 XT would be. It's likely to be the RTX 2080 Super or greater. AMD's own marketing slides compare the RX 5700 series several times against Vega. For one, it does so against die size and efficiency. It specifically compares it against the Vega 10 die, 251mm squared of Navi 10 versus 495 of Vega 14mm, and that is without the HBM2 of Vega. In another slide, it touts the Radeon RX 5700 XT is a, quote, worthy upgrade, comparing it against the RX Vega 56. That makes sense. The MSRP of Vega 56 at launch was $400, and the RX 5700 and 5700 XT is $350 and $400 respectively, although there are currently some great deals online if you do a bit of shopping about. Let's have some more context. AMD is keen to compare the RX 5500 series against their Polaris-based Radeon RX 480 and Nvidia's GTX 1650 4GB. The RX 5500 in Gears 5 achieves 92 FPS versus the RX 480 and its 79 FPS, for example. In a slide they state absolute performance, they say that it's about 12% better than the RX 480. Once again, this means that the RX 5500 is around the same level as the 580/590, depending on model, clock speeds, and game engine and workloads. It's actually extremely impressive when you think about it, given the RX 480's die was based on 14nm and measured 221mm squared, with Polaris 10 squeezing in 5.7 billion transistors. This is compared to 6.4 billion transistors of Navi 14, which measures just 158mm squared. So, if we use the performance figures of the RX 580/590, they're around 30 to 40% behind Vega 56. Once again, this does depend upon workload and model. And again, remember, the RX 5700 XT is between 30 and 40% faster than the Radeon RX Vega 56, the card that AMD is so keen to compare Navi 10 against. Or, if you want to also compare it against Nvidia, the RTX 2070. What we can say therefore is it's a pretty good chance that the Radeon RX 5800 XT will be between 30 to 40% faster than the 5700 XT, while the RX 5800 Vanilla will probably be between 20 and 30% faster than the currently fastest RDNA GPU, the 5700 XT. We'll talk about that more in just a moment though. As some of you may have come up with a flaw in this theory, if there's 40 compute units in the RX 5700 XT, but let's say 56 compute units in the RX 5800 XT, why is the gap so much bigger proportionally between the 5500 XT and its 22 compute units versus the 40 compute units of the RX 5700 XT? Now this is just a theory on my part, but I believe that in the future AMD will launch the RX 5600 series of GPUs, and it will slot in between the compute unit number of the RX 5500 series and the RX 5700 series. And this would be a great repurposing for the dies that couldn't quite make the cut for the RX 5700 non-XT. AMD could outfit these GPUs with, let's say, 28 to 32 compute units, and also maximize the yields of Navi 10. And we can also get an idea of the difference in performance between the 5800 and 5800 XT as well. If you look at the percentage difference between AMD's GPUs of the same tier, there's usually between 10 to 15% difference in the number of compute units. For example, the RX 480 contained 2304 shaders versus 2048 of the RX 470. Vega 56 had, 56 compute units, and Vega 64 had, 64 compute units. The Navi 10 core of the RX 5700 XT contains 2560 shaders, or 40 compute units, versus the RX 5700 Vanilla, which contains 36 compute units, or 2304 shaders. This is obviously to squeeze the most out of the silicon possible. For example, if we look back at the Vega series, AMD had Vega 64, 64 Liquid, and 56. The Liquid variant was identical to the Vega 64, albeit sporting higher clock speeds, 1247 and 1546 for the base and boost clock respectively for the Vanilla 64, versus the Liquid's 1406 and 1677. They would then figure out what dies would meet these different criteria for clock speeds and the number of compute units, and the lower frequencies could also help to separate the products a little more, although of course for end users you can generally overclock cards to a higher performance tier anyway. We can therefore assume that the RX 5800 series would follow the same pattern in terms of difference between the XT and Vanilla models. Also, if there's a 30 to 40% difference in performance between the 5700 XT and 5800 XT, we can predict that the RX 5800 will sport, let's say, 3072 shaders to 3328 shaders, and the XT would have 3328 shaders to 3840 shaders, and likely would see a clock speed difference between the XT and Vanilla card as well. Getting to the memory side of the equation, in the driver code there's a reference which reads num_SDP interfaces. AMD labels this as number of synchronous data port interfaces to memory, and it's directly related to the width of the bus. In the case of Navi 10, it's num_SDP interfaces equals 16, whereas Navi 14 on the other hand is equals 8. And we know of course that Navi 14 uses a 128-bit memory interface versus the 256-bit memory interface of Navi 10. This means that Navi 12 will use a 256-bit bus with GDDR6 memory then, right? Well, let's investigate that a bit further. Don't forget, we have seen faster memory released already, with Nvidia's RTX 2080 Super upping the memory clock frequencies from 14 Gbps to 15.5 Gbps. We also know that there is faster memory out there than this even, with SK Hynix and Samsung hitting mass production of 18 Gbps, and we've even seen reports back in 2018 of Micron memory hitting 20 Gbps. I actually think we did a story of that back in the day as well. So, quite easily, we could see a 512 GB per second bandwidth figures if they used 16 Gbps, or 576 GB per second if they used 18 Gbps modules, still maintaining the 256-bit bus. There are also memory modules which are either 1 or 2 GB in capacity, so theoretically AMD could choose to outfit the RX 5800 series with either 8 or 16 GB of memory, although given they're likely targeting the RTX 2080 Super, 8 GB is probably enough, at least in my opinion. So then, that's it, right? Navi 12/ the RX 5800 series memory mystery is solved. No. You see, there is another option, high bandwidth memory, HBM. You see, Vega 10 also has a 2048-bit HBM2 stack, and the drivers here report num_SDP_interfaces equals 16. So it's quite possible that we could see some type of high bandwidth memory 2 configuration. A number of you wrote to me, quite rightly pointing out that I missed out the fact that AMD could use high bandwidth memory 2 for the RX 5800 series. And yes, I definitely should have, in hindsight, included that in the video for completeness sake, if nothing else. Although, the reason I didn't originally is because I didn't feel it was a very high possibility. HBM2 is more expensive than outfitting the card with GDDR6, and cranking up memory frequencies of GDDR6 would probably have provided enough bandwidth to feed the GPU. So, while I don't believe that HBM2 is going to be used, I, in retrospect, should have included that possibility in the video. I also heard that AMD were planning to bring Vega 7nm to gamers actually prior to my unveiling it to the public. A source, I'll refer to them as Source 2, who had also told me of other details such as the Ryzen 3000 series and Zen 2, plus other Comet Lake stuff back in the day. He also told me the July 7th release date, had also mentioned to me that Vega 7nm was coming to gamers, but it was kind of offhand. So I didn't think it was worth reporting at that point. But another source, Source 3, came out later and blew the Radeon 7 details wide open, including providing me renders of the card. He also told me that the GPUs would be a limited production run more than likely. Source 1 had also told me more about this later on in a separate conversation, and crucially, much more Navi 20 information, but we'll get to that. Fast forward, when the Radeon RX 5700 XT launches, and we see that the card isn't that far behind the Radeon 7. The extra memory and compute grunt of Radeon 7 certainly has its place for prosumers, but for gamers there's no doubt about it. Navi 10 trounces it in value and makes it very poor value for money. I believe AMD's goals for the RX 5800 series will be to undermine and outperform Nvidia's RTX 2080 Super, not only in terms of raw performance, but also in price to performance ratio. But what's next for AMD's future RDNA based architectures? There was a fascinating quote by AMD's David Wang in June last year that many people have forgotten about. I think the important thing was that Scott Herkelman, who's the Senior Vice President and GM of AMD Radeon Gaming, mentioned about having some sort of consistency, delivering something to our customers so you can keep stimulating that incitement. I think that's how you keep making this business so exciting, so interesting. That's how it makes the gamers so excited about it every year. He essentially pledged that we would see a more consistent product launches from AMD. with tweaks to the architecture and said that in the past AMD had, quote, lost momentum, end quote. What we know officially is AMD are planning to launch a new range of RDNA cards next year, and this is actually confirmed in several slides. One is the ray tracing vision slide, and a second is a roadmap which shows that the second generation of RDNA will be based on TSMC's 7nm Plus node. If you're a regular viewer, you might recall that a source 4, back in March confirmed that AMD creating a card which would have hardware ray tracing, and it would be based on the second generation of Navi. They also told me that the first generation RDNA architecture was Raja Koduri's major project while working at AMD. Essentially, his job was fixing the, quote, weaknesses, end quote, within the GCN architecture and designing a card which would be much better at graphical prowess. Thinking about this in hindsight, it makes lots of sense. These cards would power the next generation of consoles too, and given Nvidia's push to graphical efficiency with GeForce, yeah, indeed, if you remember, Lisa Su had also reportedly put a lot of effort, a lot of the development funds and resources to Navi, in place of even Vega. So that's because apparently console manufacturers help fund the development of RDNA, at least according to Forbes, although whether that's true or not, who knows. Anyway, getting back to the slides, with ray tracing vision, it specifically states how AMD plan to evolve how they handle these future visual effects. Shader states Pro Renderer for creators, Radeon Rays for developers. If you're confused, this is a software-only solution, and will basically use the standard shaders to do the work. There's not much more to say about that. It's relevant for the first generation of RDNA and older cards based on GCN. There has also been lots of rumours floating about regarding AMD implementing ray tracing in the first generation of Navi cards, so the Radeon RX 5700 series, for example. This would be via a driver update at the end of this year. Thinking about this and then peeking back over the ray tracing vision slide, the first step in the ladder does specify software, although mostly for prosumer work, but potentially this does back up AMD bringing this to gamers. Perhaps then we'll see a software implementation of ray tracing for the first generation of RDNA, with the second generation receiving ray tracing support in hardware. Given there's no hardware ray tracing solution in the first generation of Navi, this is certainly possible. After all, Nvidia did enable ray tracing on Pascal, for example, albeit with less than stellar performance. But still, if you own, say, a GTX 1080 Ti, you can run RTX Quake 2 on the card, at least to get an idea of how it looks. The hardware part is much more interesting, and this is a specific reference to next generation RDNA. But it reads, select lighting effects with real-time gaming. It states next-gen RDNA, which of course means Navi 2X. We've discussed the hybrid ray tracing patent filed multiple times before, but as a quick reminder, the patent uses a mixture of dedicated hardware, which is newly added to RDNA, and existing hardware to run the ray tracing calculations. Essentially, it leverages the texture processor and makes the most out of the hardware. It is imperative though to remember that a patent does not necessarily indicate it will make it to final production hardware. Interesting, we also saw a leak recently which claimed that both Sony as well as Microsoft would be adopting different methods to implement ray tracing on their respective consoles. This is the very same leak that said Navi 5 is late. It's hard to know the accuracy of this particular information, because while the tipster speaking to Gizmodo allegedly provided them with photos of a PS5 development kit, prior to the public renderings and drawings that we've seen, Microsoft already refuted one of the elements of the story, the 4K camera in the next generation Xbox. Perhaps I'm being a bit too analytical here, but I'm extremely drawn to the ray tracing vision slide. I'm very much intrigued with select lighting effects for real-time gaming, and I do wonder whether this implementation from AMD might be either faster or more efficient than Nvidia's RTX technology, but perhaps less can be achieved using it. We'll need to wait on that. You might recall that my source 1, told me that AMD decided to use a medium-sized die first approach with Navi because they were concerned over yields. This very same source also told me in a phone call that the RDNA GPUs were actually running late and that AMD had originally wanted to launch them prior to July 7th, much earlier on in the year. But because the GPUs were running late, AMD decided to launch Radeon 7, kind of like as a stopgap to remind people that AMD still released new GPUs, and also just to get some positive press for RTG. My source then went on to say that AMD are much more confident now on the yields, hence the tape out for much larger designs. I discussed this more at length in another video. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. But my source then went on to drop a couple of bombshells. The largest of those is that he provided information on Navi 21 and 23. Navi 21 was largely sidelined in our conversations. You can make of that as you will. But he really wanted to discuss Navi 23. And one of the things he told me was that Navi 23 was internally in the engineering departments of AMD being referred to as a, quote, GeForce killer, end quote. Now, if this was a PR department of AMD, or something they said at, let's say, a press conference, such language wouldn't really be of much interest. The reason behind that is because it's the job of PR to obviously hype and build up excitement for a new impending product. However, the engineers at RTG are much more reserved in their approach, and generally would not use such verbiage. Therefore, it's rather interesting that they're so confident here. He also went on to tell me that so far the next generation of GPUs, while running late, are shaping up extremely well. He also reaffirmed that ray tracing would be a goal for gaming cards, although honestly that's not a big deal as we're pretty certain this is established and accepted by now. Apparently, the performance targets of Navi 23 were set by AMD CEO Lisa Su, as she was, quote, frustrated, end quote, with Nvidia's GPU dominance in the high-end market. If I had to take a guess, and it is only a guess, it'll be this next-gen RDNA cards that will see a ramp-up in the number of compute units significantly, likely breaking past the 64 compute unit barrier and probably hitting the low 70s to maybe low 80s for the RX 6000 series, particularly given that AMD's rivals will be hitting hard next year. What we know is that thanks to Igor's lab, the Ampere should launch in the first half of 2020, although we know precious few details regarding the architecture itself. We are pretty certain it uses Samsung's 7nm process. Reports tell us that Nvidia got a great deal on it, although given the constrained manufacturing of 7nm with long lead times from TSMC, this might be for the best. We know very little about Ampere. We don't even know 100% it's coming to gamers or GeForce. Nvidia have launched architectures in the past designed squarely for HPC, i.e. Volta, and gamers getting several thousand Pascal variants while we were waiting. To keep us sustained and, well, Turing finally launched. It's possible therefore that Ampere is purely for HPC, and gamers will get a different architecture, or there will be a Turing refresh on 7nm. I think though that Nvidia's plan here is pretty obvious. Ramp up performance, and reduce the toll that hardware ray tracing has. Intel are also a bit of a mystery, with Gen 12 graphics Xe launching next year. And another reason that I suspect that AMD will want to have a great selection of products on hand. I'll be doing a much deeper dive into Intel since there's been a lot of movement in the land of Xe since I last covered it, but the gist is that Raja Koduri recently hinted on Twitter that something would be coming in June of next year. This is much earlier than expected for a launch date of the discrete cards. Then again though, it's possible Raja and his team are ahead of the curve on release. Or that they're going to make some kind of announcement on what his team are working on or something else related. I've also been told that there are professional Navi cards on the way too, designed around workstation usage. Source 4, again, although he wasn't certain on the time frame of release, it's possible that these could be based on either the first or second generation of RDNA architecture, or both. Nvidia, Intel, and AMD have a rather interesting fourth contender next year though: games consoles. I've gone much deeper into this thought process in my Xbox Scarlet E3 analysis, but Microsoft and Sony launch a console, let's say between $300 to $400. It's going to put a lot of pressure on companies in the mid-range offerings. Without question, the PC will continue to dominate graphically. But the appeal of a games console, which costs the same or less than the price of a high-end PC graphics card, is very appealing, particularly for the first few years of a console's life, until the console gets maxed out and we don't really see any improvement graphically. Another interesting factor is that AMD are the provider of the hardware for both Sony and Microsoft. But to me, Microsoft is the more interesting of the two, because Microsoft create not only DirectX, but also DirectX ray tracing. It's hard to imagine that AMD will have a difficult job bringing ray tracing to second generation RDNA GPUs if they've already developed it for Microsoft's Xbox. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you did, then drop a like on the video because of course it helps us out a ton. And also comment down below, what were you more excited for, Zen 2 or Navi? You can also of course subscribe to the channel for much more content over the next couple of months. And you can also find us down below on social media, so if you want to follow us there, that would also be great. Just a quick reminder, this is also an article, so if you want to go ahead and check things out in the written word, well, of course, once again, the link is in the description of this video. But I thank you very much for your time in watching the video. Take care of yourselves, have an awesome day. Bye for now.